Good. Hi everyone, I'm Lily. Um, right now I work as a software and systems engineer. That's what I do. But a while back I was a historian, and I still really enjoy history, but I also really enjoy working with the cloud. So something that I do in order to sort of bring these two things together is that often I like to study the history of technology. And that's a little bit of what I'd like to share with you tonight, because I think that a lot of the stuff that has gone in the past is really useful for understanding where we could take things in the future as we work together to build something awesome. Okay, and so I want to talk a bit about the last 200 years of the internet. And, when I say that, obviously, as we know, the internet, the way we think about it, is not 200 years old, but the basic concepts that make it up date back to the 1800s. And the internet, I think, really exists in order to solve a very basic problem, and that is human communication. You know, two people trying to talk to each other, trying to talk to a group of people, and they need to be able to communicate in some way. How does that work? That's been a problem we've struggled with the entire time that humanity has existed. So, first we developed speech and language, talk to each other and say hi and all of that. And then once we could communicate face-to-face, we wanted to communicate over distances with people who weren't there. That's harder. So that led to the development, I'm echoing a bit, eh? No? All right. That led to the development of lots of stuff like smoke signals and flag waving and yodeling and all kinds of things that allowed people to communicate over a distance, or to communicate with people who were not in their immediate vicinity. But it's not good enough, because then that still requires a line of sight or sound in order to work. To communicate with people who are farther away, we developed writing. So then we could leave messages for each other on rock walls. We could write things down and give them to someone who would walk or run the distance required between one person and another to pass on that message. We could give it to someone on a horse, which was a bit faster. We could tie it to the leg of a pigeon, which is even faster than that. And eventually we invented trains. And trains were faster than all of these things, mostly because tying your message to the leg of a cheetah is quite dangerous. But the speed of the train was as fast as communication could go for quite some time. And if you wanted to communicate across a body of water, say between England and America, it would take even longer than that. The average distance in the 1800s, or the average time in the 1800s that it took for a boat to travel that distance was 10 days. So that's as fast as information could travel between continents at that point in time, which was not ideal if you're doing things like running a country or you're at war. But then over time, we grew the idea of the telegraph. And by the 1850s, this was the main method of communication for a lot of government, a lot of business, private individuals. Mostly, when I say that, I mean in Europe and also in the United States, which at that time were centers of commerce. And this word telegraph, as some of you probably already know, is from Greek roots. It means tele is part of the word, means it's far away, and graph, writing. So, you can write to people who are far away. That's great. And we do this with dots and dashes with telegraph. They represent letters of the Latin alphabet, sent as electrical pulses along wires that physically connect lots of different machines in lots of different ways. We've got a series of wires between 2 points, transmit a message that way. It can go really quickly because electricity does move quite fast. And with regard to the telegraph, there's no one real inventor. There's no one person we can point to and say that person is the person who invented it. It happened gradually, but precipitated about the same time. It's part of what we would call the adjacent present. That is, that some ideas are ripe to happen, and that when that happens, there'll be many people who come up with the same idea at the same time. Sometimes in different ways, but often it will manifest. It's sort of the same way that two people invented calculus at the same time. The idea was right, the knowledge existed in the world. There were lots of very intelligent people who could put it together. And the same thing happened with the telegraph. It sort of evolved. And then suddenly, we had the telegraph, and with invisible pulses over wires, you could communicate in almost real time with people who are in places very far away. And we're mostly just doing the same thing today. But the internet, as we usually think of it, so that's a bunch of individual computers that are all networked together, and by extension, all the information that goes between them. That grew out of academic computer networks in the 1960s and 1970s, as I'm sure most of you know. But this was, in many ways, a more advanced version of what had come before it. So a lot of the internet infrastructure was piggybacking off the telephone infrastructure, and the telephone was invented, the telephone was patented in the 1870s. So it was just piggybacking off that infrastructure already, and the telephone piggybacked off the telegraph infrastructure anyway, which sort of came out of the 1840s and 50s. So we've got all these wired networks that span the world, nodes connecting to nodes. You can send things from point A to point B. And while these signals nowadays are a lot faster, and they contain much more information and can do much more interesting things than they used to be able to do, we're mostly just working with the same principles here. We have a whole bunch of wires across the world. We use them to send bits of information. That's it. And because this is sort of the same solution to the problem of human communication, a lot of the issues that we've had with this type of tech have been the same since the telegraph came up, and we're still dealing with them now. So everything, I suppose what I want to say with this is that everything old is new again. And there's a bunch of stuff that we can learn from the first time around that we did this when it was in its first iteration that still applies now. There are a couple of things that I want to touch on in particular that I think are worth focusing on. And the first one is net neutrality. The basic idea of net neutrality, a lot of you may know, is that people should be free to browse and consume any internet content that they want, whenever they want it, without internet service providers or the government interfering with that in any way or stopping it. Because some companies and governments will try to slow down or tamp down connections on services that they see are being used that they don't want to be used. Or conversely, they'll make the system faster for things that they would prefer that you use instead. So there's a slow lane and a fast lane, and some people end up being second-class citizens. But the idea of fighting against the proprietary control of networks like this goes back to the very early days of the big telecommunications companies. And this is most predominant. I think the biggest telecommunications company, in the way that we would understand it today, started off with the radio. And that was the Marconi Company. So I'm going to take you back to the year 1906. That's Marconi. Very accurate likeness. Yeah, recognize, yeah. And that's a radio. That's not the radio that Marconi was selling, but it's a radio. Well, it'll do. So this is in the year 1906. Marconi, he's usually credited with being the father of radio. If you look him up, that's usually the thing he gets, like he invented it. What really happened, like with a lot of things, was that he was in the right place at the right time and had the business savvy to make an idea really fly. He didn't invent the radio. He wasn't the one who discovered radio waves. He was really good at marketing and selling. So he tends to get a lot of the credit for it. And so in 1906, this was just sort of when they were figuring out what radio was good for in a commercial sense, and they were mostly using it as a replacement for the wired telegraph. The same way, they would send pulses, in this case, of noise, so dots and dashes, short noises and long noises to represent letters of the alphabet, Morse code, just exactly the same way. And that would be able to communicate with people all over the place without the need for wires, which was just mind-blowing. And Marconi Company, they were the first real big tech company. They sold these wireless sets. And their brand name was a bit like having the Apple logo on your phone. So, oh, you got a Marconi, that's cool. They were also pretty money hungry and patent happy as well. If there was anything to do with radio that they could slap a patent on, they would do it. regardless of whether they discovered it or developed it or what. If they could get there first, they would do it. And they were very happy to sue people who tried to do anything with radio. That was a tricky thing as well, because it meant that nobody else could come in and innovate on top of that without paying Marconi a lot of money. And ship-to-shore communication was their really big seller. This was the idea that, you know, you've got a ship out at sea, you've got a couple of ships out at sea, and you've got people on the shore. Normally they hadn't been able to talk to each other because it's hard, it's water, but with wireless they could. And that was revolutionary. That meant for the first time, if somebody saw a storm coming, they could radio ahead to a ship and tell them there was a storm coming, and the ship could avoid the storm, and lives would be saved, the stuff the ship was carrying would be saved. It was a really great thing for everyone involved. So people were pretty keen to invest in this technology, particularly for ship-to-shore stuff, and that was the big money maker for Marconi. And he really liked his monopoly. It was lucrative. But he, as I said, he wasn't really a great scientist. He was a great businessman. And there was probably a lot of people out there who could build better tech than he could. And he didn't want them to do that because then they would get the money and he wouldn't. So he tried very hard to put the dampener on this. He said, I don't want anybody else to be able to communicate with my Marconi radio sets at all. And it's not really possible to stop people from communicating radio to radio. It's just the way radio waves work. But it didn't stop him going around and telling people that that was what was going to happen. So there was a real issue with this. He was lying through his teeth and he was just putting it all out there and saying, nobody else is going to be able to use this stuff. And he was charging an arm and a leg for it. And this really pissed off a lot of people. So the governments of a lot of the countries, especially Western countries, especially European countries, were really annoyed at Marconi and the whole situation. And they all got together. There was an international radio telegraph convention that was held in Berlin in 1906. And this was basically the first anti-Marconi conference in the world. This was the leaders of, I think, the British government, the Belgian government, Germans, Italian government, quite a bunch of them, all got together and told Marconi he had to stop it because they were fed up with having this stale radio tech. They were fed up with everybody having to pay him, including the governments had to pay him for a license. They knew that this technology was completely new and revolutionary and was going to change everything. And they also knew that if they allowed people the opportunity to do stuff with it, they might do cooler stuff with it than what Marconi was doing. And that meant that if you had more competition, prices went down, everybody got better stuff cheaper. And so they decided that that was what they were going to do. So they more or less just stepped in and stopped Marconi completely. It was also partly in their favor because at this point in 1906, everybody was getting a bit antsy with each other in Europe, and this was not really a good time. And this precipitated a couple of years later into World War I. But at that point in time, they were far-sighted enough to realize that if they wanted a communication method during a turbulent time, what they would have to do is get something that couldn't be cut. Wires can be severed. Radio waves can't. So they'd stepped in and safeguarded this. And then we have the radio system that we more or less use today, which is great. Anyone can pick it up and use it and do stuff with it. Provided you understand how frequencies work, you're pretty good. And ultimately, what this really meant is that these sort of monopolistic, segregated ideas of what communications networks could be like, they were never really going to work. And the government had to step in and stop it directly from working. But when other people try to apply this in other ways, it doesn't tend to work, partly because the bit of turf they're fighting over becomes obsolete. A lot of the wars that were held in telephone land after that ended up not mattering in about 10 or 20 years because people had moved on. And this really tiny patch of land that you'd fought to protect, no one cared about. And the other thing is that in the long run, it made absolutely no economic sense to do this. So it fizzled out. And I suppose what you take from that is moving forward, opening things up helps, making things neutral helps, creating monopolies. Generally not helpful if we care about building good technology. But we've been through all this before. Another thing we've been through is the pain that is involved with rolling out networks worldwide, and I think that particularly in Australia right now we're having a pretty tough time with that. So building these complicated networks of wires all over the world is actually really hard. I mean, we see it in Australia right now. Australia is a big country. We've got an old network that's slowing down, and we need to rejuvenate it, but it's really hard. It requires you to actually physically go and lay out all that infrastructure again. And that's tricky, and it takes a lot of time. And then, you know, with regard to international networks, they're always subject to damage. You know, sharks eat the undersea cables. You lose internet. People who dig in the ground can accidentally sever the internet link for an entire country, depending on where you are, and that's not great either. These sorts of networks, they're inherently flaky, they're hard to design, they're expensive to roll out, and they're expensive to maintain. So it's a big pain. And the other problem is that they're often at the mercy of government policy. And when they go to roll it out, it could be rolled out with the best of intentions, but then the next election cycle comes and something else becomes more important. And often it falls to private businesses to pick up the slack and actually finish the job in the way that people want them to. So, for instance, with the most recent NBN rollout promises that have or have not happened, there have been a couple of local companies. Digitech in Melbourne recently announced that they were going to start up 1 gigabit per second fiber to the home service. They're starting that up in Eltham and Brighton, I think. They're actually going to start rolling out the cables themselves because no one else is doing it. And Lightning Broadband in July announced that they were going to put out some really high-speed wireless stuff to compete with that, because we're really hungering for a high-speed network here and we really need one, but we haven't got one, but people want one and there's money in it. And predictably, we have been through all this before, and this was with the transatlantic telegraph cable. So the original telegraph wires generally tended to follow railway lines, and they were hanging up in the air, and they were hard to maintain too, but the biggest challenge came trying to get communication between the UK and the US in the middle of the 19th century. So you remember what I said before about the ship taking about 10 days? People got kind of fed up with that when they could communicate nearly instantaneously within their own countries. And they decided that they needed to do something about it. It became the next obvious thing to do. But putting an undersea an undersea wireless cable, telegraph cable, putting an undersea telegraph cable in place had never been done before. It was an absurd concept. The Atlantic's really big, the cable's really long, and trying to stretch that out over that distance and make sure that it actually worked from end to end was something that people weren't entirely sure they could physically do. But they figured they had to have a go at it anyway, so the British government, the American government threw a bunch of money at the problem, and they decided that what they were going to do, this was 1857, was, you know, they were going to try and give it a go. So what they did was they went from the westernmost point of Ireland to Newfoundland in the Americas, because those were the two closest points by land, and then they could branch out from there. And they hired this guy, who has a most amazing name. This is Edward Orange Wildman Whitehouse. This dude is probably a whole talk in and of himself. He was a retired surgeon. He had these amazing mutton chops. They were incredible. And he'd been dabbling with telegraph technology. And he really didn't know much about it. And he was the lead engineer for this project. It was great. So that was fun. They decided, you know, the best thing to do was to get a ship, get the cable, however you've designed it, and you sort of just roll it out the back of the ship as you go across the Atlantic, and that's what they did. The cable itself was enormously heavy, and it kept breaking, and it took them 4 times, leaving Ireland, spooling it out. It broke. They had to go back and start again, get more cable, leave Ireland, it would break, they go back. They did this 4 times. Probably got really tedious. And they got the science wrong on the design and the use of the cables. The main thing that Whitehouse wanted to do was he figured in order to reach that distance, you needed a really strong current to run through the cables because it was a long way away. And it was like shouting, more or less. And the other thing that he wanted to do is make the diameter of the cables, the wires themselves, really small. So it was, you push it at high speed across this long thing, that would work. And he wanted to weigh the cable down really heavily so that it would sit across the bottom of the floor of the sea, wouldn't get in the way of ships, that kind of thing. But he didn't count on this guy, William Thomson, scientist who actually knew what he was doing. Later went on to become Lord Kelvin, who has done many other sciencey things. You probably know mostly from measuring things in degrees Kelvin, that's him. So he was involved in the first project, but not especially heavily because he was doing other stuff at the time. And he publicly contradicted White House's science at this point in time, and White House more or less stuffed his fingers in his ears and went on with it anyway because, he's lead engineer. You don't get to be lead engineer if you don't know what you're doing, except this time. So they rolled it out and they tried again and they tried again, and eventually they got a cable that went from one, all the way from one end to the other, and they sent a signal along it, and it kind of got received, but they weren't entirely sure what it was because it got all jumbled up along the way. And then after about a couple of days, the cable just stopped working entirely. And this was a huge public embarrassment because they publicized this. Obviously, this huge big piece of infrastructure that's going to connect the entire world. People wrote all kinds of really terrible poetry about it. It was amazing. And it didn't work. And the Queen was trying to send messages to the President, and the President's trying to send messages back to the Queen, and they're getting very angry because they can't. And White House didn't make it very easy for himself either. A lot of people came up to him and said, this isn't working, you're the lead engineer, what's going on? His response to that was to write a huge book about how stupid everybody else on the project was and publish it, which didn't end well for him. He got fired for some reason. And they hired Thomson. Yay. And tried it again. In the second time around, because they weren't entirely confident that it was going to work, they'd wasted a bunch of money the first time. They finally managed to find some private backers who threw a bunch more money at it. And this was 1858, so the very next year there were clearly some people who really wanted to get this connection going. They used a design that Thomson had put together based on his knowledge of actual science. And they made the cable lighter so that it didn't snap under its own weight all the time, which is part of the problem with the first one. He made the diameter of the wires wider, which is what you need in order to send a current along a longer distance, the wider it needs to be. And he realized that you only needed to send a very light current through the cable at all. The diameter was really the thing that needed to happen. And part of the problem with White House's cables was that he was sending this huge signal through it that actually fried the cables, so they may have lasted longer, even if they hadn't broken under their own weight, if he'd dialed it back a bit. But he was actually breaking his own cables as soon as he tried to send anything through. So Thomson didn't do that, and they tested the signal as they spooled it out, just to make sure that it worked. Didn't work, they would go back, find where it was, check it, fix it, spool it more. They actually also dropped the first one when they tried the first time. They're not immune to that. But when they tried the second time, they had enough knowledge to go and pick the first one back up so that by the time they'd actually gotten all the way to the United States, they had 2 working transatlantic cables, and the 2 ones that actually worked, which was kind of cool. So there are a lot of lessons in this particular thing that I think that we can learn as well. Firstly, it's pretty clear that infrastructure investment is expensive and horrible and painful, but it needs to be done right by people who really believe that it can be done and stick with what they're doing. And also, if the government is not going to invest in it, it is going to fall to private business to do it. And once the private business actually succeeds in doing it, they're the one that gets all the credit and all of the accolades and all of the money that comes out of it. But then you also fall back into that loop, like Marconi, where the public is again at the mercy of corporations who own the networks, trying to control how they're used. So we've got this interesting cycle going on between the two problems, and there's a balance, I think, somewhere in there that we could strike, given this knowledge, with what we're building in future. But it's worth calling it out. And this sort of brings me to the main lessons from the last 200 years. As I said earlier, we've been using the same solution to this problem of human communication for almost 200 years now. And I mean, it's pretty obvious that we're doing that if you think about the fact that, for instance, when you had the abacus back in ancient days, that would count, it was an ancient calculator. If you looked at that, there's no way that you could extrapolate the calculator app on your desktop from this particular device. But as soon as the telegraph was invented, pretty shortly after that, you have depictions of what essentially looks like Skype and smartphones and stuff like that, which makes sense because these things are the logical conclusion of future ideas of what this technology you have now could be. And that's what we have now. We're using the same stuff. So we can make this sort of distributed network solution faster and cooler and send cat gifs, and that's cool. But we're also going to continue to have the same questions about it because we're continuing to solve the problem in the same way. And we're also doing this, committing ourselves to being stuck in this feedback loop between requiring governments to invest in the infrastructure, governments not doing that, companies building the infrastructure, companies creating monopolies on the infrastructure, governments having to legislate against it, onwards. And we've kind of just been doing that backwards and forwards the entire time. So part of what I want to ask is there a way that we can solve the problem of human communication that isn't by building a distributed network the way we've been doing for the last centuries? Is that something that we could do that would escape some of the problems that I've just described? And if it isn't, if we're going to keep doing this, then can we do this with an eye to the past, with knowledge of what's already happened, instead of thinking about the next election cycle instead? That might be helpful in the way that we go forward. Because regardless, we're going to keep talking to each other. We're going to keep wanting to communicate with people who are very far away. And it's up to all of us to be smart about how we do that. And that's all I wanted to say.